Are you a pervert or something? Okay. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
Hold on a sec. I just
National
want to.
Pornographic says it.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15 what?
The whales have a 15-foot penis. I didn't cut out. You heard me. Google it yourself. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15 what?
Are you a pervert or something? Okay. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
Hold on a sec. I just
National
want
Pornographic
to.
says it.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15 what?
The whales have a 15-foot penis. I didn't cut out. You heard me. Google it yourself. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15 what?
Are you a pervert or something? Okay. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
Hold on a sec. I just
National
want to.
Pornographic says it.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15 what?
The whales have a 15-foot penis. I didn't cut out. You heard me. Google it yourself. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
I'm sorry, Ken. You cut out there. They have a 15
Are
what?
you a pervert or something? Okay. The whales have a 15-foot penis.
What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Tonight we have Converse Contender here. He has some questions. I recently did a video where I was responding to a live stream that he and Praise That I Am did, and he did a sort of a couple of responses back, and we just both felt it would be a good idea to talk. Which I know that you're a very busy guy, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to, talk to me about some of these things. So, we're going to be talking about history, Paul, and miracles, if we can get to them tonight. So if you guys will, I do have, if I'm not mistaken, I have a click to tweet link down in the description. If you want to let people know about the discussion going on, definitely go down there. Also, Converse Contender, all of his links to both his YouTube channel and his Twitter are down there. So if you like what he's saying tonight, definitely go subscribe, follow him over there. So, how you doing tonight?
Good. How y'all doing?
Everything's
good. I see Vandy in the chat saying that snowing in SC. That's where I'm at as well. So it is snowing outside and sleeting a little bit. So
yeah,
but it's let it snow, because I'm regardless of how our conversation goes at night, I'm waking up tomorrow and I'm going snowboarding. So
well, yeah, it's really weird because we had quote unquote snow here today. Really, I mean, it was snow until it hit the ground because it was wet. Like the ground was wet from raining all morning, and so nothing stuck. But we still had some I guess basically frozen rain.
yeah, it's not really sticking here, but I'm driving up to North Carolina to the mountains tomorrow, so for my bachelor party. So I'm ready for that, and that'll be pretty cool.
Yeah. Oh,
actually,
and
I got these. I just went to the store earlier and got these little things.
Oh, cool.
128 proof. Don't tell any Christians though. I'm not supposed to be drinking this.
Oh, okay. What flavor is that? Moonshine?
Yeah, they were just at the counter when I bought some whiskey, and they were just these little bombers. They're called Blue Flames, and they're 128 proof, whatever. But I just thought, it's my bachelor party, and I'm not going to go out on the town getting drunk, but probably go snowboard and then come back. I've got a cabin rented, probably have a fire, and there's a hot tub there and stuff, and just some close friends and family. So it'd be cool.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and congratulations on getting married. Yeah, it's a great thing most of the time.
Yeah, we'll see, huh? We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm excited, man. It took me a while to find the right one. I have a son by another woman that I never did marry. I've always been really careful with marriage. There for a while, I felt like Paul, where he's like, can't we take a wife? But for me, I'm not taking a wife. Paul's kind of outlook on marriage, for himself at least. he seemed to think that
Mhm.
it was incompatible with being an apostle. But so I kind of felt like that for a little while until I found the right one. So, and I'm sure you know how that is because I know you have a beautiful wife as well.
Yeah, and I have a son with my ex-wife. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah,
How old?
he's 10.
I have an 8-year-old, so we're pretty close. How old are you?
I'm 35.
All right, I'm 31, so we're pretty close in all of that, pretty much.
Yeah, pretty close. Okay, so you were wanting to talk to me about history at first.
Well, here's the thing: is I feel like all these topics are going to blend because when we
Mhm,
talk about, I don't feel like we'll go, all right, here's history. Let's talk about only it, and then we'll move to Paul, then we'll move to miracles. Because what I feel like is that, when we talk about history and we're talking about the Bible, like it seems like your only real like history that I can appeal to you is going to be Paul for the Bible at least. And so I feel like while we're talking about history, I'm sure some Pauline like train of thought is going to blend together with that. And then when we're talking
mhm.
about Paul, I'm sure the miracle aspect is going to blend with. So it'll just just a fluid conversation. But I guess we'll start with history. Let me ask you this: like, what? So I'm trying to understand how far your mythicism goes as far as um I've heard of some people, like I know a guy who I used to go to school with that he takes a mythicist position, but only about like Christ and he says maybe Buddha. And like, but like, all right, so let's just take another historical figure like the Prophet Muhammad. Do you think that Muhammad ever existed?
Oh, really, I'm not sure about Muhammad because I haven't looked into like the historical like validity of Muhammad. Um, plus, I mean, Muhammad was what was it like 600 years later, like after Christianity was
Yeah.
established.
I just
So,
was wondering, like, do you think he might be like that he was a historical person or do you just,
may, well, I
go ahead.
mean, maybe. Like I said, I haven't really investigated that, but like, there's plenty of other figures that we could compare in history, like Caligula, which I mentioned
Sure.
Caligula right off the bat because that was one particular section that I was working on today, in my Crestus app. Um, but like Caligula definitely existed in history. People like Pius and Pontius Pilate. Like, I mean, there's a lot of people in history that we definitely know existed in history because of a lot of different pieces of evidence.
Okay. So, like, the reason why I brought up Muhammad though was because, um, like, I think the majority of people would say Muhammad existed, right?
Hmm.
And if you look at the evidence, it's actually pretty scant. And I actually believe that Muhammad did exist, but there's a book written by Robert Spencer. No, that's
Hmm.
not Richard Spencer. For some reason, I have to say that, or people will automatically think that the author is some racist. It's Robert Spencer, and he does a lot with Islam, and he basically wrote a book called "Did Muhammad Exist?" I believe it is, and then he actually had a debate on it with David Wood. You should watch it if you get a chance. He basically goes into like Muhammad's life and some of the things about Muhammad, and he goes into sources around the time Muhammad existed, and he basically says like, okay, so if Muhammad existed, right, then
Hmm.
why is it, and then he goes into the different details. He'll say like, for example, okay, so Muhammad existed in the Quran. There's a story about Umar going to Sophronius of Jerusalem, and according to the Muslim account, Umar met him at the gate, and then he gave Umar the keys to the city and walked him around. But Umar didn't want to pray in the temple because he knew that it would make it a mosque the for Islam, and that they would turn the Jewish temple into, or the temple there, into a mosque. And so that's why he says he didn't pray. But the story is first recalled several hundred years after it's supposedly taken place. But when we look at Sophronius's writings, um, he speaks about how the Seraphins and the Ishmaelites came and laid waste to the city and conquered the area, but he shows no awareness of a new holy book or of a new prophet or a new religion or anything even remotely related to Islam. and like I say, he called them Ishmaelites and Seraphims. Like he never called them, you know, Muslims or anything like that. So I was just saying, like, I was starting with that because although all of that is the case, I still believe that Muhammad existed as a person because of the, obviously we have hadith writings and things, but even they are later on, right? He was in the mid, 600s, and then we don't have the hadiths completed until like the end of the 800s. So, but given all that, I still think that Muhammad existed because it's more likely that he existed than not.
Well, okay, so how I've learned, to establish how historical an event or a person is you have sort of a tiered system of the quality of evidence. So your best quality of evidence would be like physical or archaeological evidence, and then you would have eyewitness testimonies, people that interacted with him or saw him or lived at the time of him, and like for instance dated certain things by the fact that they were raining, or they mentioned them in their writings or whatnot. They're contemporaneous, right? And then a worse quality version of evidence comes from like secondhand information. That would be people that wrote about these things, but
About
what they
somebody
did,
else.
huh?
Yeah, like somebody who mentioned like, John was there, but it was not John writing about it. It's somebody mentioning that John was there. Like that would be or like giving some situation about what John said. You're saying that would probably be a
Well,
secondhand account of what John said.
not not exactly. So what I'm talking about here is somebody mentioning these people or things that happened, but they cite eyewitness sources that are not available to us now. So it really depends on who they are using, like the sources that they're using in order to inform them. Because if they weren't contemporaries or eyewitnesses to it, then they have to ground their statements in some kind of source in history. So, like a good example of this is with okay, so take Caligula for instance. You have like Suetonius and Tacitus, I believe, that were writing about him, and Seneca that were writing about him. But see, the thing is that they were using eyewitness testimonies that they had access to that we don't have access to now, even though they were writing over 100 years after Caligula died.
Right, but don't you criticize Suetonius as a reference though, in
Well,
regards
no.
to talking about Christ?
Well, in regards to talking about Christ, Suetonius references Christus, which is an actual Jewish name at the time, rather than Christus.
Well,
So that's why I criticize him. Plus, there's motive, and there's plenty of scholarship around Christians manipulating and interpolating these kind of sources in order to attest, not necessarily doing it maliciously, but like they either accidentally or maliciously interpolated these things. And so that's why I challenge the Suetonius, like saying, oh, this definitely means Christ, not just because that's what I want it to be, but because that's what peer-reviewed scholarship has shown.
well, wait a second, because didn't it seemed like I've seen somebody talking to you about the term Crustus before, and telling you that it meant while it was a name, but it also could stand for a title, same as Attila the Hun or something like that, right?
What, Christ?
No, like the name Crustus can also be used as a title in the
No,
same
no.
way. Right?
Well, no. So in that particular thing, if I remember correctly, they were talking about how the Attila the Hun wasn't the person's actual name, like
Right.
Attila the Hun was a title, not
Right.
that Christus was a title. Christus was a name. Like it's a verified Jewish name at that time.
Let me ask you this: do you think that Tacitus is a reliable source?
Well, so I think Tacitus is interpolated, but my caveat is that even if, like, let's just take Tacitus at face value, and this isn't like my reasoning. This is actually Robert Van Voorst's reasoning in Jesus Outside the New Testament. He in there correctly states how both him and R.T. France, who's another historian, correctly point out that the best that Tacitus can give us is that there were Christians in Rome during the burning of Rome. And I mean, even then, Tacitus is writing in the 2nd century.
Well, sorry to interrupt. But isn't it the case, because I'm pretty sure I read that Tacitus is considered by the consensus to be a reliable historical source about Christ? Independent source.
No. I would not say independent. There's
No, but I'm saying that's what I read, is that Tacitus is, the consensus considers him as a reliable historical independent source.
okay. So what? Well, I mean, what would make him a reliable historical source concerning Jesus Christ?
Well, it's I remember Greg Boyd, arguing
Okay.
that I don't remember which work that he wrote it in, but I remember him citing that, if I'm remembering correctly, that Tacitus is an authentic source to use for historical reference to Christ. And
Okay.
actually, I have a reference, if I can just pull it up on my phone real quick, if you don't mind.
Okay. No, that's fine.
Just for that.
Because I mean, what I technically asked was what's the argument or what's the logic behind Tacitus being a reliable source? Because, see, when I look at Tacitus, the line in there that specifically represents like Jesus Christ of the Bible, that's the exact problem with it, is that it represents Jesus Christ of the Gospels. The Gospels were written in between 70 and, well, the Synoptics were written between 70 and the end of the 1st century, right? So with Tacitus writing in the 2nd century, he would have been just regurgitating what Christians believed at the time. It was already established, like those particular facts that are laid out in Tacitus, if we consider them to be uninterpolated, were things that Christians would have believed in the 2nd century. Do you agree with that?
I date the Gospels a little earlier than that.
Well, okay, sorry. In either case, like whether or not you consider them to be earlier or later, which I think that substantially there's evidence for later, but regardless, even if they were earlier, it just makes my point even harder, right? Because it would have been well established in the Christian community, those particular facts. So Tacitus had regular contact with Pliny the Younger, who was interrogating Christians at the time. So there's a clear like route of communication for him to learn about what common Christians were thinking in the 2nd century.
Yeah, but Pliny also mentions Christ, right, in the Christians.
Well, he mentions Christians and them talking about what they believed. He doesn't mention like Christ, as in he cites a contemporary source of Jesus Christ in around 30 or something like that. Like he doesn't mention a source for it. The source that he mentions are Christians that he's interrogating. So that's why I say in the 2nd century, Christians would have had the basic gospel in mind that Christ died by Pontius Pilate, and then he was resurrected, and then I believe Pliny the Younger talks about when they gather and some of the rituals and everything like that.
So he mentions that Christians believe that Christ died and rose from the dead and these kind of things, but And I'm sorry, I looked up. I couldn't find my reference, so I actually looked it up on Google to see what my reference was for Boyd, and it just brought up an article on Wikipedia. I hope I know you're not going to necessarily accept this as like some type of scholarly source, but it says regarding Tacitus, it says the scholarly consensus is that Tacitus references the execution of Jesus by Pontius is both authentic and of historical value as an independent Roman source. And Paul Eddy, which I'm not familiar with him, and Greg Boyd argue that it is firmly established that Tacitus provides a non-Christian confirmation of the crucifixion of Jesus, and scholars view it as establishing three separate facts about about Rome around 60 AD. One, that there was a sizable number of Christians in Rome at the time. Two, that it was possible to distinguish Christians and Jews in Rome. And three, that at the time pagans made a connection between Christianity in Rome and its origins in Roman Judea. And it obviously there's more to it than that, but I know I hate to bring up Wikipedia, so don't don't crucify me for that. But
Well, no, but I mean, like, see, nothing that's in Tacitus is separate from the Gospels. So, I mean, you have to understand that I get that they are saying that that's a scholarly census, and regardless of whether or not it is the consensus, the actual context surrounding Tacitus does not make sense. And it's not me that is saying this. Like, this is not my logic. I'm getting, like, I've read Van Voorst's book. I read the section on Tacitus in Van Voorst's book. He goes through the entire context of Tacitus. And at the very end, he says that you cannot establish that Tacitus is independent from the Gospels. And the key things is that he was writing in the 2nd century. He was talking to Pliny the Younger, who was interrogating Christians at the time. And by the 2nd century, you had Christians that would have had those common things that were part of their faith. Like those things that Tacitus mentioned did not develop later or come with some other kind of understanding. Regardless of when the Gospels were written, either late in the 1st century or early in the 1st century, they would have known by the 2nd century all of the things that are listed in Tacitus. So there's no way that you can separate Tacitus from the Gospels.
Now you're saying that they would have known in the 2nd century about what Tacitus said? Is that what you were saying?
No. I said that in the 2nd century, they would have known those particular like facts that are presented in Tacitus. Those would have been common to the Christian theology of Christians in the 2nd century.
Okay, but and you're saying that Tacitus probably got his information from Pliny? Is that correct?
Well, I mean, that's one possible source. Of course, Tacitus doesn't say where he gets his information from. A lot of apologists out there like to say that he got them from Roman records, but there's no evidence to suggest that he got them from Roman records. That's just an ad hoc assumption that he did. But the fact that Tacitus was regularly writing to Pliny the Younger, who was in a neighboring province that was interrogating these Christians, there's a high probability that he would have told them about them, even if Tacitus is an authentic work. But you have to understand that I think that particular part's interpolated. It is forensically proven that it actually does not say Christus, but it in both places it says Crestus. But I mean, we kind of already covered that with Suetonius.
Well, so Pliny was writing in the 1st century, no?
Pliny was not. Pliny was 2nd century.
Do you know the date on Pliny? Do you remember?
It was. I don't remember exactly. I'm wanting to say it was
100 or
early.
something?
It was early 2nd century. I think like maybe 110. Hold on, I can pull up my my Crestus app real quick because I have.
Yeah, I mean it's been a while since I looked at Pliny, but I remember Pliny the Younger, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it being around 100, but yeah, maybe a little later. But So you think that he might have been the earliest source to write about Christians, or
Yeah. So, well, Pliny? No. I don't. I mean, I don't think that he was the first one, because obviously the Gospels were written in the first century while Pliny was writing in the second century. I have my app here, which you guys can see, and plus there's a little ad below me for if you want to go and get it. Pliny the Younger lived between 61 and 112 A.D. He wrote the one letter that mentions a worshiping of Christ between 110 and 112, and that's about 80 years after he supposedly died.
okay.
So yeah, he was definitely writing in the early second century.
Okay. So he would have been born, what, around 30 years after Christ died, and
Mhm.
he didn't write until he was until about 110.
Yes.
So then I guess if you don't accept those sources as necessarily pointing to a historical Christ, what do you think about the writings of early church fathers?
There were no early church fathers that were writing in the first century. So the early church fathers would have just been talking about what they have already believed.
Well, wait a second, because hang on a second. What about the Apostle John? Polycarp was one of his students. No?
I mean, I don't know about that exactly. I mean, regardless of whether or not he was a student, apostles were just people that received revelation. They were not disciples.
Well, right, but John the Apostle, his direct student was Polycarp, and Polycarp writes in multiple. We have multiple sources about Polycarp. One of which is a letter that he writes to Pope Victor, in which he tells us how well he knew the Apostle John, and he says, that the Pope Victor had said something that he found that Polycarp found to be heretical, and he said something like, I don't remember exactly, but you can look it up. He just basically said, "Look, I know the Apostle John. We used to stand underneath the oak tree, and he would teach us lessons and about Christ. And um, when if he would have heard what you just said, I know what he would have done. He would have threw up his hands, then ripped his clothes, and then he would have said, 'Lord, why did you let me live long enough to see this type of heresy in the church?'" And
I'm
so,
not in the church though.
what was that?
I'm not in the church though. So
No, no,
why
not
would?
you, not you. He was
Oh,
writing
okay.
that about Pope Victor. Pope Victor had said something that Polycarp found heretical, and he was saying, "Look, I know the Apostle John. We used to hang out with him under the oak tree, and if he heard what you just said, Pope Victor, I know what he'd do. He'd rip his clothes and he'd throw his hands up and he'd ask God why did he let him live this long." Like, it's pretty interesting. And then also Ignatius was a student of John. Both Polycarp and Ignatius were, and then of course
Okay.
Polycarp had his students like Irenaeus and Justin Martyr and so on. But
Well,
I,
still, but still, regardless of the historicity of the Apostle John, which, as far as I could tell, the only historically accurate apostles that we can solidly say existed were Paul and Peter. And then, of course, Paul also mentions the other pillar, James. I don't recall if Paul mentions the Apostle John, but regardless
well,
of that, the apostles wouldn't have given an earthly account of Jesus. They didn't talk about the earthly accounts of Jesus. All they did were talk about the revelation of Jesus. But also, I'm not exactly sure when Polycarp was living, because I mean, it,
he was born in the '60s.
huh?
He was born in the '60s,
Well, yeah, but
and
that puts the Apostle John living on into at least what, the 90s.
the Apostle John, yeah, he wrote. This is John that wrote Revelation. He wrote it in the '90s.
Oh no, Apostle John did not write Revelation. That
Well, that's what. What? Go ahead. What were you about to say?
There were no apostles that wrote the Revelation. The Revelation was written far, far later. So, I mean,
Wait,
the apostles would not have written Revelation.
wait a second. Do you what do you why do you think that that Revelation was written way later? Can you give your reasoning behind that?
Oh, what was it? I haven't. I've only I've looked through the arguments for the dating of Revelation, but I
Mhm.
want to say Revelation was centered around. Oh, it was some kind of war. I want to say in the 2nd century. But
Okay, because so I thought in the 90s. So I just looked up on Google like who wrote, and obviously this isn't a scholarly source. You can pull, later on when you think about this, you can come back and go, well, here's why that's wrong. But like the first thing that pops up is the book of Revelation was written sometime around 96 C in Asia Minor. The author was probably a Christian from Ephesus known as John the Elder. According to the book, this John was on the island of Patmos, not far from the coast of Asia Minor, because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus, Revelation 1:10. So um, it's been that's what the I believe it's at least what one tradition teaches, that the Apostle John is the one who wrote Revelation. And this isn't just somebody that, seen a vision of Christ necessarily. It's somebody that was connected.
mhm.
There's a scholar that I listened to, Ken Johnson. He's written a book on the early church fathers. Um, I think he's on maybe on his third book about them now. He's been doing this for maybe 15 or 20 years or so, and I don't trust everything he says necessarily, because he has a strong dislike for Calvinist and also um, Catholics. But I mean, I understand like why but sometimes some of his views I don't accept. But that one I think he may be right about that, because if you read because you said that you hadn't really read much Polycarp, but if you read, like, he talks about the Apostle John, and also Ignatius was a student of John, and he talks about him as well. And then obviously Irenaeus was a student of Polycarp, so we hear what Polycarp taught him about what the Apostle John taught him. And so even in Irenaeus, that's one of the big things about tradition, is he goes, well, look, like, he starts talking about these other churches, and he goes, like, these other people, like the agnostics and others, and he goes, well, hold on a second. I was taught by Polycarp, who was taught by John. We have a direct lineage back to the apostles, and John knew, the other apostles. Like, these other people, they don't have any lineage back to anybody. So, like, that's one of their arguments. And so,
Well, so okay, what I have down in my app is that Polycarp, Christian bishop of the mid 2nd century, who was born around 69 and died around 155. Some
mhm,
legends imagine him to have studied under the Apostle John and knew
mhm.
others who had quote unquote seen Jesus, but there is no actual evidence that that is true, and it's highly unlikely, as there is no evidence any apostle was actually alive when Polycarp was even a schoolboy. And we have no text from
That's not.
Polycarp himself. Huh?
Well, hang on a second, because what were you about to say about we don't have any text from Polycarp? What are you going to
No,
say
no,
about
no.
that?
Well, no, you're jumping ahead of me here because
Yeah, I'm trying to
uh,
go ahead.
right, and we have no text from Polycarp himself making this claim, nor do any letters we have addressed to Polycarp mention it. It's also
Mention what? John the
about
Apostle?
no, not just about the Apostle John, but about like studying under him or knowing him personally.
Yeah, we do. His letter to Pope Victor. I mean, it's all you got to do is look it up. It's a letter to Pope Victor, and he says, "I knew John the Apostle, and he used to teach us. And John, I know what he would do if he heard your heretical teaching, and he kind of schools him on it. So you can check me on that and make sure, and if you want to leave it for now and come back to it when you think about it, or like whenever you like look into that source to make sure that it is that I am being, that I'm not confused about it. But I remember reading that specifically, and because I thought it was, it's an interesting text. Obviously, if he's talking about knowing John and telling this Pope, I use it like I've used it before when I was talking to my Catholic friends, and I say, yeah, look at his letter to Pope Victor, where he tells him that he's teaching heresy, and that he recalls John teaching him. So feel free to follow me up on that. But maybe there's one more thing that we would say about I heard you mention that Paul knew. Did you say James? But you don't accept James as being the brother of Christ, right?
Well, so that's a bit of a nuanced position there. Later on in Galatians, Paul does mention James the Pillar or James the Just, but the James that's mentioned in Galatians 1:19 is a completely different Christian that's just a baptized Christian. He calls him a brother of the Lord, but the problem with that is that that's too ambiguous to say that he was a blood brother. Because the actual word there in Greek, adelphos, means both. That it could either be a blood brother or a fictive kinship. Since Paul hold on. Since Paul already has the concept of brothers in the Lord, and that every baptized Christian is therefore a brother or sister of Jesus Christ, then it makes that particular sentence right there ambiguous. And if he wanted to be clear about it, he could have said brother of the Lord in the flesh, which he does in other areas of his work when he wants to distinguish somebody that was like of blood relative relation. So that particular part, brother of the Lord, considering Paul's position on that particular title, seems to indicate that it was a fictive kinship rather than anything else.
Well, I tend to agree with Bart Ehrman in his debate with Robert Price, where he goes, well, no, he's specifically contrasting him with Cephas, and he says he talks about Cephas, and he mentions Cephas, and then he mentions and the brother of the Lord. So, as Bart says, like he's contrasting those two. So if it's just like, well, he was, like a Christian, like a brother in Christ, he wouldn't have said Cephas and the brother of the Lord, and
Well, from what I understand of Greek, which again, I'm not an expert in Greek or anything like that, but what I understand from Greek is that the definite article there, while it's very meaningful to us, it was pretty common at the time to use a phrase in that way. But regardless of that, I do think that he's distinguishing Cephas from, or Cephas, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. He's definitely distinguishing Peter from this James. But where we differ is what you consider this James to be. Because I just consider him a normal baptized Christian, because that's coherent with the rest of Paul's theology and how he references other baptized Christians later on. Because like you mentioned earlier about how you really liked Paul's theology, I guess, on taking a wife. In that particular section, he calls these wives sisters. So unless you want to go as far as to say that these other apostles were taking their literal sisters to be wives, then I think that it would behoove us to lean towards the fictive kinship.
Well, it's interesting though that you bring up. Are you talking about 1 Corinthians 9:5 or 9, chapter 9?
I can't remember the exact verse, but it's where he's talking about like why can we not bring our sisters with us.
So in 1 Corinthians 9:5, that in that same passage he distinguishes Cephas and the other apostles from the Lord's brother. He says, don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas?
Well, yes, and like I said before, that's still coherent with my position on it. Because
how is he? Go ahead.
Well, because he's separating out the different types of Christians that there are. There are apostles; those are people that have received revelation of Jesus, and then there are common Christians, which could be brothers of the Lord, or brothers of the Lord could have been a special title where they were more than just a general baptized Christian, but they were still just Christians. It has nothing to do with being a blood relative of Jesus. Now, it is possible that they somehow secretly police that particular term to only refer to bloodkins of Jesus, but there's actually no evidence in history to suggest that it was being policed in such a way. So, like I said, taking Brothers of the Lord as either a title for a certain kind of Christian is way more coherent with Paul's theology than accepting that Brother of the Lord is only used to refer to a blood relative of Jesus, because the actual word used there, adelphos, means both. I mean, let me ask you this. Do you agree that Brothers of the Lord, or this fictive kinship, was definitely a theology of Paul?
Yeah, so I believe that brother and sister in Christ is kind of used in that way, but the thing that differentiates it, and this is where I agree with Bart Ehrman, is when in the context he distinguishes people who would be brothers of the Lord, right, and the apostles and the Lord's brother and Cephas. When he distinguishes between all these people in multiple verses and the Lord's brothers, I think that Bart's right on this. I mean, I take his view. Now I could be wrong, and
So,
go ahead.
well, I was just going to ask, what considering the word that's used there, Paul's theology, what is the definite evidence that proves that I'm wrong about how Brothers of the Lord is used?
Well, if they're so this is what Bart says, right? And he teaches Greek. He obviously, he says there's two different ways to think about this. There's the way that you say, oh, it's my Jewish brother or my Christian brother, my brother in the Lord, or my sister in the Lord. And then there's my blood relative, my brother. And he says, when you look at this, if in either of these verses he were to just say that he would just be using kind of like the fictitious kinship, or like my brother in the Lord, he wouldn't have been distinguishing between fellow followers of Christ. In fact, like if you look at other passages where some of the ways that we know, like that Luke was a Gentile, is like Paul will talk about my fellow workers of the circumcision, right? And then he'll talk about Luke separately, so we know, like, that's not the only way we know Luke. Obviously, his name's Lucas, and but Paul specifically uses things like this to distinguish between people. And so, like I said before, I think that I agree with Bart on this, but that's what I said at the end. Is I said I think Bart's right on this, but I could be wrong about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that is a more plausible view, and I don't want to say it's consensus, because that doesn't really, like you said before, like, yeah, that doesn't really matter. But like, I do think that's a more plausible view to say. Now I'm saying
Well,
that it may come out that you're right, but I think until we have something else that is a defeater, I would have to say that was more plausible.
but you see, I don't understand why it's more plausible, considering, like I said, considering how Paul's theology centered around how he considers other baptized Christians. He literally says that that Jesus is the firstborn of many brethren. Like he talks about the relationship between the baptized Christian and Jesus to be a familial thing. He has that whole theology. So I'm just kind of curious, like what for you definitely what for you distinguishes the use of just a brother in the Lord and like a blood relative. Like, I get that Cephas and James are being distinguished here, and I totally agree with that. But when you take Paul's theology into consideration, it seems to lean more towards a fictive kinship. But I still ultimately think that the passage is ambiguous. So it's not that I think that it's definite proof that he wasn't talking about like a historical Jesus. I just think that it's too ambiguous to use for either case.
So here's what I'll say about it. Maybe I'll make a couple points. Is that so in Romans 8, right, when Paul when he says that for those who God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Um, obviously, that has a context, and I'm sure like we don't need to get into the theology, but like in that specific verse, there's no distinguishing between anybody. That's just a general. Um, he's the firstborn amongst many brothers and sisters. But the thing that distinguishes it for me is whenever there's a contextual usage of the term Lord's brother in reference to a specific person, and that it's pinned up contrasting that person between fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord, let's say, right? And in that way, that's what I would that's what would distinguish it from me. But I would just say that I don't think that this is what I don't know you well enough to like try to psychoanalyze you or anything, but I know that Bart and other people seem to think that the only reason why some people like Price take this view and that they don't want to see that there's a distinction made here is because if it's the case that Paul knew Christ's brother, then obviously he wasn't a myth, right? So that's like kind of I don't think this is something that you can just go, okay, so Christ had a brother. Still, he wasn't a historical figure. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think this is one of the things. It's like it overturns the apple cart. So
Well,
I think it is something. Go ahead.
But I mean, I do feel like you're saying there that I just don't want it to represent it. When I've spent the last 10 or 12 minutes laying out how the context of Paul's theology coupled with the word that's actually used right there, and just the grammar of the sentence in general. Like, I've given multiple reasons as to why I'm doubtful about this passage, but I don't understand how it's really warranted to say that, oh, well, you just don't want to believe that this is referencing a blood brother of Jesus. Like, that's literally so far from the actual truth that it's kind of insulting.
Okay, I can see why you took it that way, which is why I kind of preferenced what I said, but because here's the thing: when we have a model of something, and I'm looking at let's take for example quantum physics. There's almost 12 different there's almost a dozen interpretations of quantum physics, and some of them are completely deterministic, and some of them aren't. If somebody who's looking at somebody else's model and they go, yeah, and they go, well, I don't think that it's deterministic because of this. And then he goes, yeah, you couldn't, or it would change your entire model. Like, you have to stick in your model, right? And so, because if you did, then you would just switch to a model like mine. I don't think that it's an insult to say things like that, because you're just pointing out like that, hey, there's a paradigm shift here. It's not, and like I say, I distinguished at the beginning to say, like, I can't psychoanalyze you. I don't have a clue. Maybe you're willing to change, but I just think that, and maybe we can move on, and I'll let you say something else, and then maybe we'll move on from this point. But like, I think that whenever it does distinguish the Lord's brother from in multiple passages from other brothers of Christ, right, that are mentioned as brothers in Christ and sisters in Christ as well, I think that is at least good evidence that they're using it in a specific way, even if it's just like a literary device for the purpose of distinguishing him. So, but if you want to say something else, maybe we'll move on.
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that position. My entire position is that, yeah, he was distinguishing in them, but it just, like, even when you look at the Greek and you see the ambiguity of the actual word of that's being used, like, you still think that I just don't want it to be ambiguous?
Well,
like, I'm literally just reading the definition of the word.
Yeah, but I don't think it's actually that ambiguous. Like, the same word can have multiple days. Like, I mean, it can have multiple meanings, but still in context, like a single usage of a word makes it, is a better fit for that word.
I mean, he doesn't use it anywhere else to show a pattern that he only uses it to refer to blood kinship. Like all of the verses in Paul, which there's only two that I can think of where adelphos is used in this way, it's all ambiguous. So like I find it quite insulting that you just want to throw it up to me not wanting it to be true when I've got multiple lines of reasons that that show that I'm not being unreasonable about this. I have this view of it. While we disagree about it, I think that saying that, oh well, you just don't want it to be true is, I mean, it's a bit disingenuous.
Yeah, but I think you're stretching it a little bit. Like, I don't think I actually said that. I think I, said something like, if this were the case, then you would have to change your entire model. It's not like you can just accept this fact and move on. That was my point. And the same thing for me. Like, well, I don't know. With me, it would be just another fact. It'd just be like, oh, well, maybe it's not talking about the Lord's brother, but there are other historical, references here. But with you, I think that would kind of upset the whole apple cart, and maybe that's just like a point in passing, and maybe it's not of any significance because it's like, well, it doesn't matter if it would upset your theology or your view or not, if it's true or not. Like, it doesn't necessarily have any bearing on whether it's true or not. I was just saying that, like, if I accepted that it's not referring to Christ having a brother, it doesn't upset the historical position. But with the mythicist position, I do feel like that it kind of changes it changes the whole dynamic. And so you're admitting that, and like I say, that's what Bart said in that debate. He just kind of said that, like, you know what do you, I mean, if Paul knew the Lord's brother, obviously that changes things. So
Well, yeah, it
if you
does,
took it
but
that way, I didn't mean it that way.
well, I mean, I know that you preface with that you can't psychoanalyze me, but it's a lot like saying, well, I don't mean to be racist, but because I mean, you psychoanalyze me, and it doesn't matter if you prefaced it with, I don't know you, I don't mean to psychoanalyze you, but I'm going to go ahead and psychoanalyze you and say that, well, you just don't want it to be true because that would debunk your idea. And like you said, you don't know me. I would love for there to be hard evidence, like if there's archaeological evidence, or if this particular passage didn't say brother of the Lord, which is a title. If it said brother of Jesus, or Jesus of Nazareth, or brother of Jesus, even Jesus Christ would have been way better than brother of the Lord. Like, I would love for something like that to have actually existed, because I thought that Jesus was a historical person. And then I critically looked at the evidence, and I came out the other side not being convinced that he was an actual person in history. So, I mean, I get that you weren't trying to be offensive, but when you assign motives to people, or you assign feelings or actions that people didn't actually like take, or anything like that, it really comes off the wrong way. But I mean, we can move past this point if you want to, because I mean, we have kind of driven it into the ground.
Yeah, sure. Let's I got another question for you. So along with that, like, you don't so with Paul, you don't think that Paul actually thought that Christ was a human being or a person. You think that, and I'm just saying this, correct me if this is a straw man, but I know that Price and some others believe that, that Christ was crucified by the archons, which basically meant that he was killed in some type of stellar, or like some place in astrological place. The God Christ, or whatever the case may be, was killed or crucified by some type of demon alliance, the archons of the Scion, or what's your take on that?
Okay, so Paul separates himself from any human source on earth. He never claims to have known Jesus on earth, and he doesn't claim to know anybody that knew Jesus on earth. And he separates himself in Galatians 1:11 when he talks about how he doesn't get his his gospel or his information about Jesus from any human source, but it only comes through revelation by Jesus Christ, either in visions or through scriptures. And the part that you're talking about here is kind of a mix between the ascension of Isaiah and a verse in one of Paul's letters. I can't remember the exact place where it is, but he talks about how Jesus was crucified by the archons of this aeon. And archons of this aeon was known to be referencing Satan and his demons. And in the ascension of Isaiah, what happens is that Christ, he descends from the upper heavens down to the lower heavens, up on top of the firmament, which is the area between the moon and the earth's atmosphere. Christ would have descended down and was crucified by the demons and Satan in the lower heavens, and then he resurrected and ascended back up into heaven. Now that's specifically in the Ascension of Isaiah, and it ties into Paul's writings when he mentions archons of this aeon, because in Paul's theology and Christian theology in general, the ruler of the earth, or the ruler of the lower heavens that's right above the earth, is Satan, right? He rules this world. And also it's in the Christian theology that there's a sort of a copy of whatever's on earth there is also in heaven. So it's a rational position to take because of the ambiguity in which Paul talks about who exactly crucified Christ. Because in that particular section, Paul could have said he was crucified by the Romans, but he chose this very specific title that also referenced Satan and his demons.
Well, you said that Paul, the first part that you said was that Paul never claims he knew an eyewitness or eyewitnesses, or has any communication with eyewitnesses. But what about in Galatians, where he says, after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days, and I saw none of the other apostles except for James, the Lord's brother.
Yeah.
So he met James and Peter.
Okay. He doesn't talk about getting information for them. In fact,
you said that he didn't claim to know any or have met any of the eyewitnesses.
Well, right. They weren't eyewitnesses. Of course, we disagree on the James part, but Cephas, he was an apostle, along with James the Just. They were both apostles. All apostle meant was that he received revelation of Jesus. Okay.
So you don't think that either of them saw Christ?
There's no evidence to there's no evidence to suggest that Cephas or James the Just specifically knew Christ while he was alive on earth, because of the nature of the apostles, of the status of apostle, but also because of the fact that in Galatians 1:11, Paul says that he didn't get his information from any person; he only got it from Jesus in Revelation.
Right. Well. I mean, and I can concede that, but I would think that. So I guess for number one, being an apostle, and that meaning that you had an experience or you saw a vision of Christ, or saw him after his death or whatever, doesn't negate that Peter may have seen Christ before he died. And then with James, I guess that all hinges around whether he's the Lord's brother or not, whether he actually saw him ahead of time, right? Because it says he's the Lord's brother, but in the way that I'm using it, right, it would imply that, if my view's correct, then he obviously seen him. So that was the first thing. And then in the second thing, where you're talking about the Ascension of Isaiah and so on and so forth, can you tell me when the Ascension of Isaiah is from?
Yeah, it was written sometime in the 1st century. The earliest redaction that we have was written in the 1st century.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought that most scholars dated it to at least the 2nd century.
Well, there are some versions of it that date to the 2nd century, but the earliest redactions of the Ascension of Isaiah dates to the 1st century.
I'll have to look at that, because I looked up a few days ago the Ascension of Isaiah, and from what I read, it said 2nd century, but I could just be missing something, and maybe you know more about that than I do, so I'll concede that. But I would just, what was that?
Oh, I was just going to say dating these texts is not going to be hard lined, right? There are generally like time frames in which they are said to be unwritten in. And so probably what consensus scholarship or whatever you want to cite says is that it was written in some time frame, and I can bet you that time frame also is in the first century. And then you're going to have some scholars who date it earlier, some scholars who date it later, but and I could probably get you some pretty good sources for an early dating for it, but basically the earliest redaction can be traced to the first century, or most likely was written in the first century.
You don't think it predated the Gospels, do you?
I'm not sure about that, but I
You
also don't think.
predated Paul, though,
Huh?
surely. You surely don't think it predated Paul, though, and you're
Well,
saying that he used
so
it,
well,
or
well,
at least he
so
had the same theology.
well, I mean, he had similar theology to it. I think that it's a Christian text that represents a certain Christian sect that was active in the first century, and it's the only text that we really have that represents them. But I mean, there were obviously people in the first century who didn't consider Christ to be of fleshly origin. You have the Docetists, for example, that were
Mhm.
that were operating at that point in time, who didn't consider Jesus to have come in the flesh, but he was purely celestial. But I'm not exactly sure when that particular idea originated, but it definitely originated in the time frame surrounding like Paul. And just because it was written in the first century, but more than likely the theology of it existed plenty of time before that, because I mean, you have Christ, the whole gospel, or not the whole gospel as in the gospels that were written, but the idea of Christ and everything like that existed since at least in the later 30s, because that's when the 1
Well,
Corinthians 15:3-8 is dated to, and I'm fine with that dating.
sure.
So I mean, uh, for it to for me, I go with the late dating on the Gospels, and I know you go with an early, but scholarship
Well,
points to a late dating.
yeah, well, we can just leave the Gospels out because you still think that the Gospels probably came earlier in the ascension of Isaiah, but it doesn't matter because you definitely think that the Paul came before the ascension of Isaiah, I would think. But on the ascension of Isaiah, um, from like I say, from what I've read, there was a lot of scholars thought that at least second century, but I'll give you that it could have been later in the first or whatever. But wouldn't you agree with me that scholars have shown now that Gnosticism not only is later than comes later than Christianity, but that it is based off Gnostic philosophy is based off of a philosophy that says spiritual is good and physical is bad.
I mean, I'm not exactly sure about that. I just know that it's referenced in works like 2 Peter. It's referenced that there were people that didn't consider Jesus to be a real person, and
Yeah, but you don't think Second Peter? You think it came way later, then, right?
I can't remember exactly when Peter was dated, or 2 Peter was dated. I'm wanting to say that it
A
was
lot of people think
probably in the
late.
second century.
Yeah, a lot of people think late because it wasn't included in Irenaeus's list of scriptures in the second century, and I think it might have been included in Hippolytus's list, but I'm not 100% on that. But yeah, Gnostic philosophy says that the spiritual is good, but the physical is bad. So you'll see in Gnostic texts, for example, these motifs of like Judas becoming the good guy because he helped Christ escape his, fleshly body, which sucks, and get to the spiritual realm. So he did a good thing, Judas or whatever. So you see these patterns because their philosophy is based off of the flesh being evil, and they derive that from some of the earlier Christian sources, which say things like "Don't be carnal" or "flesh-like" or "That's you acting in the flesh" and things like that. But the Christians didn't mean it like that at all, because obviously they go out of their way to say that Christ actually rose into a fleshly body. But let me ask you one more thing, and then if you want, this might actually help us transition to the last topic, because you know that I've got to moderate a debate here in about an
Yeah,
hour.
yeah.
But
I'm good to go whenever you
sure,
want to.
we'll give it maybe another 15, 20 minutes or so. We'll see how it goes. But so I guess I'm wondering, what is it going to take for you to think that Paul was thought that Christ became flesh or became a human being, or in the likeness of a human? Let me just ask you this: if we found a manuscript that was dated early, one of Paul's earliest writings, that said something like Christ became, in the likeness of a human, or like John 1:1, like he became flesh, would you accept it then? That Paul thought
Well,
that
I mean, I
Christ.
think that. Well, I mean, I do think that Paul thought of a fleshly version of Jesus, but that doesn't see the crux of Paul is that he never references anything that Jesus did on earth. He never references Jesus prior to his death. Paul only ever mentions him existing after he supposedly died. That's the problem with Paul. What I would expect out of Paul, like for a contemporary source like Paul, what I would expect is either him citing people that actually knew Jesus and Paul talking about things that Jesus actually did in his life instead of the theology that Jesus was pushing. Like those are two
Oh,
different things.
but hang on a second, because he talks about Christ being a man that was crucified, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, this is part of like the idea of a Messiah. Like they're even now you have people that interpret the Old Testament scriptures to indicate that the Messiah would come, he would be shamed and even pierced. Like it doesn't matter what the actual scriptures say or mean in context to when they were written. It just matters how they were interpreting it. And we know for a fact that they were interpreting the Old Testament to give some kind of indication as to what Jesus was supposed to do in his life, because the Gospels themselves only ever cite scriptures, but also more importantly, Paul says that according to the scriptures we know these things. So Paul points back to his only source being scriptures and revelation whenever he's talking about anything that Jesus supposedly did.
Well, so wait a second. You think that, okay, so you accept Paul's a source, but you say that, okay, so maybe Paul thought that Christ was an actual person, but that
Well, no, no,
he was a
no.
myth. I'm
Like
trying to.
like an actual person on Earth is different from being like made of flesh or whatnot. The portions where he's talking about Jesus being born of a woman or whatever like that,
Mhm.
the actual wording there again is ambiguous. Because it's also contained in a parable or allegory, where it's a fictive kind of mother. So
Okay, well, what about? Oh, I'm sorry for interrupting. What about when he says, what about in the Carmen Christi, Philippians chapter 2, where he says, have this mind amongst yourselves, who, which is in Christ Jesus, who, then it says Christ and Jesus there, who, though he was in the very form of God, did not count it as a thing to be grasped, the equality he had with God. I'm sorry, did not count the equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form. He humbled himself by being obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Like
well, yeah,
when
but
I
the
read,
Greek. Sorry, go ahead.
well, I was about to say, Bart Ehrman was asked this question. I actually have a playlist in my YouTube channel called Philippians chapter 2, where I have James White and some other biblical scholars that go and take, like, he takes Bart's answer to this, because Bart was asked this on Unbelievable. And he takes Bart's answer and he goes through the entire thing. He goes through the languages. He goes through Bart's interpretation of the verse, and Bart doesn't deny that it says what it says. He just basically says, "Oh yeah, well, they believe that Christ, before he was born in the flesh, that he was an angel or something." Like,
Hmm.
but as James White points out, like that is like, where do you get that hermeneutic from? Like that's a stretch.
Well, he probably gets it from Philo of Alexandria, who directly says that a Jesus who's the made in the image of God is an angel in the chorus of angels. He's actually the Word of God who regularly makes appearances in the Old Testament in order to bring humans the Word of God.
Well, yeah, but the term angel, right, can mean all it means is messenger. Do you agree with that?
I mean, I'm not exactly sure on the etymology of
Okay.
angel or
Yeah.
anything like that, but the fact is that even in the Gospel of John, the very first verse talks about how Jesus pre-existed everything. So,
Sure, but that's what I'm saying is that it says Christ, who, though he was in the very form of God, did not account the equality he had with God a thing to be grasped. So he emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men,
hmm.
and being found in human form, he humbled himself to the point of obedience, even the point of the death on a cross.
So what is the actual Greek word that is used there?
I can go grab my interlinear if you want,
Okay.
but like I said, that playlist that I have, it has James White breaking down the Greek, and like he teaches
Well,
Greek.
well,
Go ahead.
yeah, but I mean, an apologist is going to apologist.
Well, yeah, but you can. Is that? I mean, that's the genetic fallacy,
No, no,
right?
no, no. That's not a genetic fallacy. I'm not saying that because he's an apologist that makes him wrong. I'm just saying there's a pattern to apologists, and apologists regularly miss out. Like, for instance, on this particular verse, the actual word is genomai, if I'm not mistaken. And genomai actually means being manufactured or made, not necessarily born. And it's using born in the form of like when an idea is born or something like it. It's made, like it's made. So the whole idea here is the idea that God, used, for the lack of better terminology, the sperm of David in order to make Jesus's earthly body, right?
Mhm.
That or not earthly body, but to make his fleshly body, basically. But I mean, all of this corresponds with other Jewish or Jewish Christian thinking at the time that we have evidence for in the ascension of Isaiah, because he descends from the lower heavens, or from the upper heavens to the lower heavens, and he takes on this body that can die, right? And then he dies and he ascends up to the upper heavens. So that's yeah, him being made of Davidic flesh is actually more coherent than what the Gospels talk about.
Um, Sorry, I'm laughing at Dragnot. He's in the chat. Just says CC looks like he's about to drop his newest collab album with Vanilla Ice. All right. All right. Since he's throwing these, all right. Well, Drag looks like. Do you remember that show, that Disney show, Smart Guy?
Yeah.
He looks like an older version of Smart Guy. He looks like a younger version of Carl Winslow when he doesn't work out. Sorry, he was.
I don't
He was
know.
clowning.
I mean, Dragnut does plenty of streams with his shirt off. I don't really think he looks like Carl Winslow.
No, I'm just joking. He jokes about all the time. I watch his show like every day. He jokes about being overweight, and so I give him that crap. But anyway, well, maybe that's a good place to stop. I mean, we didn't get to everything we wanted to, but I do have to set up this debate and moderate in about 40 minutes. But I
Yeah.
guess what I
What's
would
that about?
last thing I would say about that is that you said that, well, maybe it's not born, maybe it's manufactured, but I think that in the context it says that he emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant. So he took
Mm-hmm.
on this form of the servant, and then it says being born in the likeness of men. So let's say that's manufactured in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself to the point of death, even the death on the cross. I think that even if that was changed to manufacture, that it still makes the same point. And so,
Well, I mean,
um,
but I mean, so if you read all of that, and you have the context of him descending from the upper heavens, taking on a mortal form in the lower heavens so that he can be crucified and killed by Satan, and then reascend up back into heaven, which is, I'm not saying that that is what Paul is saying here. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that this is another Jewish Christian idea at the time, like that Paul would have most likely known about at this point in time. So if you read all of that again with that in mind, is there anything in what Paul says that refutes the idea that that is at least probable as to what he's talking about? Because I feel like that passage is ambiguous enough. Plus, it's encased in a parable, an allegory, one of those two. It's encased in that so that it's figurative language. So I don't think that there's anything in there that actually refutes the probability and possibility that he's talking about that version of what happened to Jesus.
Sure. Well, I guess all I would say about that is just that I would just say that I personally find it more probable that Christ existed in history, given the people that was closest, earliest there. Talk about him being a person. Now I know that you can take a drink because I'm going to say Bart Ehrman. Okay, but Bart Ehrman opens his debate with Robert Price by saying, no matter what else you can say about Christ, you can say one thing, that he most likely existed. And he said, no matter what else you want to say about him. Now, with that, I would just say that, that I find it more probable, right? But I wanted to ask you one thing before we, take off, and maybe, I don't know if you want me to take some questions or something like that, a couple questions, but have you ever heard of the Testament of Benjamin?
Testament, I have not heard of that.
A lot of people haven't heard about this. This is really interesting because the Testament of Benjamin is a Second Temple work found with the Essenes, right? And this is really cool because it's basically a pseudepigraphical work which is attributed to actual Benjamin, like the youngest son of Isaac. Is that right? Yeah, I think it was
yeah.
the youngest son of Isaac.
I'm not sure. There's a lot of kids in the Bible.
Joseph's youngest brother, and the 12 tribes of Israel, the youngest of the 12 tribes. So yeah, it'd be Isaac, because Isaac. Okay, so Benjamin. So it's called the Testament of Benjamin. It's supposed to be from that. It's basically like, hey, I'm Benjamin or whatever, and from my seed will come this person that's going to be like the person who goes out to the Gentiles and like teaches them or whatever. So that's really interesting, because then Paul says, he specifically talks to people and mentions, I myself am from the tribe of Benjamin. And so some people think that he's referencing that Second Temple period work, and he's called to be the person that goes to the Gentiles. But also there is his experience happened on the road to Damascus. Well, some people are, and I'm not saying this is what I believe, I'm just giving this because I think it's interesting, and I thought you would be interested in it as well. Some people think, well, not a whole lot of people know about this, but like the people who have read it think that the Essenes, where they were, sometimes there's like this word Damascus can mean like their community or something like that. There's a tie to the Essenes community in Qumran, where they lived, and Damascus. And if you think about it that way, and the Dead Sea Scrolls in their works, we find the Testament of Benjamin, and Paul talks about, he's called to go to the Gentiles. He's from the seed of Benjamin, and that he had his experience and his change on the road to Damascus. Some people think that it could have been that he was introduced to these works, by this community or something like that. But anyway, that's totally speculative. But I thought, who would be interested in it? Probably you.
I mean, I hadn't heard of it, so I'll have to take a look at it. What I will say before we head out is that I do think that it's possible that Jesus existed. I think that we've discussed some of the best evidence that historicists have here tonight, and that would be Paul's usage of the term brothers in the Lord. Not that I think that it definitely says anything about whether or not Jesus existed, but I think that it's the kind of ambiguous statement that we can't really make a determination, at least in my view, we can't make a determination one way or the other. Whether or not he was talking about fictive kinship or a blood brother, like I feel like that's the strongest point because it's an ambiguous statement. But I do think that it's possible. Carrier gives a 1/3 chance that he existed, and I'm probably somewhere in that area too. Maybe a little lower, but I think that the evidence is more coherent with the idea that he was not necessarily invented, but he was interpreted as being on Earth because of what they understood about the scriptures, about how they were expecting a Messiah to come and rescue them. I feel like that is way more cohesive than what evidence we have for a historical Jesus. Because I feel like if there was a historical Jesus, there would definitely be a lot more evidence. Like he would have, considering what not only the Gospels claim about him, but what is generally thought or said about Jesus, he would definitely have a lot more evidence to suggest that he actually did these things, right?
Yeah, I mean, on that point, and I don't want to reference the Bart's debate again, but like, I think that it is true that he was mentioned. There's only one person that is attested to better than Christ in the first century, and that's Josephus. But if you count independent writings, of people that are writing about Christ, he's better attested to as far as having a narrative about his life than Josephus. And that, if you take Christ as not actually performing these miracles and things and just being, like a rabbi or whatever, it wouldn't be surprising that if nobody mentioned him. In fact, who mentions Caiaphas? The highest, the priest of the time, the highest religious leader of the time. Who mentions him? I mean, like, if Christ didn't really perform these miracles, it's crazy that he did even reach us at some point. I mean, so I mean, I guess that's how I would respond. But there is something I want to respond to in the chat that I just noticed it. Somebody said that the Bible, that I believe that Converse says that the Bible is 6,000 years old, and then Drag says no, he doesn't believe that. He takes the reading from people like Ellen G. White. Both of those are wrong. So I do take an older view. I believe modern science. I believe the consensus modern science. I believe in evolution. I could be wrong about that as well, but I take that because of all of my just the research that I have done. But I would just say that it's not Ellen G. White that came up with the fact that there could. I mean, even as far back as the 3rd century, Saint Augustine said, that perhaps that it was flawed to think that the days were 24-hour days, and it makes sense, obviously. I think John Lennox, he has a book called 7 Days That Changed the World. That book was one of the earliest things that I read that helped me to change my mind on that. And so I didn't really read any of Ellen G. White's stuff. So, but I just wanted to say that before. And then somebody else asked, I mentioned a pseudepigraphical work, and somebody asked, that means forged in the name of, right? And yeah, it just means that they're writing it as if they are the person that's attributed to it. So the Testament of Benjamin, they're saying they were Benjamin, the person that actually existed back during the times of the 12 tribes of Israel. The patriarch, the fathers were still around. So.
Well, and I got to push back on you. Jesus is definitely not the most attested to person in the 1st century. Pilate has more evidence. Caligula has more evidence. Even going back before the 1st century, you've got Julius Caesar, who has way more evidence. You've got Spartacus. He's got way more evidence. Like, there's plenty of other people in history that have way more evidence than Jesus. Jesus in my view, Jesus really only has like the one person that attests to him, and that's Paul, and he doesn't even say that he was on earth. In I'm saying that's how I see it.
Sure.
But definitely, huh?
That could be wrong. Maybe Bart was wrong about that, and maybe he just like misspoke or something. I'm just maybe he was wrong about that. Christ is the only person that was better attested to in the first century was Josephus. But like I say, maybe he's wrong about that. He's not necessarily the only person that can speak on these matters. So I wouldn't be surprised if he misspoke there. But at least I would say he's pretty well attested. Obviously, we're going to disagree on that because it depends on the sources and who do you accept. Like, do you accept a brother? Do you accept the Gospels and so on? So he said in that debate that he thought the Gospels were independent, um, were independent sources. So, and you don't believe that. And he used the rationale that, well, Matthew uses sources that Mark and Luke doesn't use. Luke uses sources that Matthew and John and Mark doesn't use, and Mark uses sources and John uses sources that the others don't use. And so, he says in that sense that they are independent. And I know you would disagree with that, so we don't have to go down that road.
No. We don't have to go down that way. But yeah, so I really appreciate you coming on. I do have a super chat to read. That's
Sure,
from Kristen Wagner, who says, "When I was 7, I renounced my faith, Catholic school to public. Church was strange then. Now, the more I know about the Bible, the weirder I think it is."
Christine Wigner, thank you so much for your $6.90 super chat. That's what I'm going to be doing for the next hour and a half, probably.
Yeah. Well, what is your what is the debate that you're moderating tonight?
It's going to be a 3-way debate. It's interesting. It's funny because the last 3-way debate I moderated on Modern Day Debates channel was a 3-way debate on pornography. So this one's going to be a little more tame. It's a 3-way debate on capitalism, socialism, and communism, I believe. So it's going to be a political one, and should be pretty cool.
Yeah, so if anybody out there wants something else to do after this stream, you can go on over to Modern Day Debate and you can check out that particular debate. But other than that, this was a really good chat. I think that we were able to talk about a bunch of things that got brought up in our response videos. So I really appreciate you taking time out of your night to talk to me.
Yeah.
And
I think you're pretty reasonable, and more so than I didn't get a chance to watch a ton of your stuff. I watched a couple things, but from what I heard from some other people, that you're a lot more reasonable than some people say, and I think that you've looked into the history of this more than some people want to give you credit for, I would say. So thanks for having me.
Oh no, thank you. That's I consider that like at least a 4-star review, of me as a YouTube creator on here and a person in the discussion. So I really appreciate that. But in any case, everybody definitely follow Converse Contender on Twitter. I've got all of his links down there. He's got a YouTube channel as well if you want to go subscribe to him over there. If you want to support the stream, definitely hit up that click to tweet link so that you can tweet this discussion. And I guess we'll see you heathens later. We don't have any more questions, any more super chats, so I'm going to go ahead and shut it down. Normally I take other questions, but I'm going to save that for tomorrow night on our live stream where we're discussing, I believe it's evolution. So also I got new shirts. Evolution is a fact, by the way, and I'll see you heathens later.